Monica.
All right, guys. So we'll transition into talking a little bit more about some of these ideas. We're happy to do a little bit of chatting about kind of explaining an autism diagnosis, and so many of the themes that came through in the case and the ideas and questions you were asking are going to tie so nicely into this. So perfect segue. And I think as we were thinking through this topic and preparing these slides, thinking about like how you might explain autism and your child's needs to different audiences, right? So maybe that would be the autistic person themselves, maybe that would be a sibling, maybe it's a grandparent or other extended family member, but also maybe it's someone that's kind of new in your child's life, like a coach or a camp counselor. So obviously, these concepts are pretty nuanced, and the conversation is going to look so different depending on the person's relationship to your child and also kind of what knowledge and experiences and maybe even preconceptions they might bring to the table. But so the plan is I'm going to start things off with some concepts and ideas, and then I'm really excited to hand it over to Monica. She'll be able to share her perspective as a parent who I'm sure has navigated these types of conversations in many different ways, and specifically to talk more about, navigating these conversations with a sibling. So we can go to the next slide. So one idea for how to frame these conversations is kind of through the lens of neurodiversity. So I think this is a word that we hear a lot now, which is amazing, but unfortunately it can sometimes mean that it loses its meaning a little bit. But so the best way that I've found it defined is this idea that individual differences in brain functioning, so things like autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, those are all kind of normal variations in the human population, and they're not something that we need to stigmatize. And so our goal should not necessarily be to expect a person to learn how to appear neurotypical, but really to make sure that they have the supports they need to, lead a happy and fulfilled life. And so it's really important to be clear that this kind of framing of neurodiversity doesn't suggest that people with these diagnoses don't need help and support, but it might kind of reframe the type of support that we're providing, or kind of like how we're approaching our intervention or how we support an autistic person. So this is kind of a concept that was a little bit of a light bulb moment for me in my career. And I think this is maybe something that was coming through in the case today. But so a little bit of background. So as a speech therapist, a really common experience that we have is we might be one of the first people, if not the first person in a family's life to bring up the possibility of autism. So I don't know if there's any parents on the call that have had this experience, but a child might come to see a speech therapist because the family has noticed they have some delays in their speech and language skills. And then maybe the speech therapist is the first person to notice and talk about features of autism and then refer them for a more formal developmental evaluation. And so, to be honest, in the past, kind of early in my career, I sometimes found myself kind of hedging about this or kind of talking around possible autism or kind of like skirting the issue a little bit. And it's really dawned on me one day, this idea that, me avoiding this topic of autism was often contributing to a family's stress and confusion. And I don't know if any of the parents on the call have had that experience. If you're kind of early on in your journey, if you kind of had this feeling like people weren't being clear with you or direct with you about what might be going on with your child. So if we're not talking about something, that's sending a message that it's something that's scary or taboo, or something that needs to be stigmatized. And I think that's kind of what maybe, unfortunately, through no fault of anyone's own, happened in the case, that there was this, because it was unspoken, this idea that it was something that was scary or bad. And so I think this concept is something we can apply, in other conversations with other people as you're discussing autism. If we don't explain to people what autism is, that sometimes kind of allows people to kind of fill in the gaps a little bit based on what they know. So the child in this case knew maybe some kids with autism in their class, that was what they understood autism to be. So that can kind of lead to misinformation, or maybe other people in your child's life kind of misunderstanding them and their needs. We can go to the next slide. So at its kind of most basic level, if you were starting the conversation with someone to explain what autism is, one idea would be explaining that autism is a different way of processing and perceiving the world. So it means a person's brain works a little differently, and different doesn't mean bad, right? And maybe you would take it one step further by explaining more specifically, autism involves differences in two different areas. It involves differences in how people communicate and maybe interact socially, and also differences in how they behave. So maybe some repetitive behavior or specific interests, that sort of thing. And really highlighting this idea that these differences can look very different in each person. Next slide, please. And so depending on the audience, they might have questions. And I'm thinking particularly for these kind of ideas, maybe for the child themselves if they're asking questions, but also, if you're talking through these concepts with like a close family member or a friend, a grandparent, something like that. Maybe these are some other concepts you might want to like dive into a little bit more. Again, I think a pretty key concept is this idea that autism is a spectrum. I think at this point, most people have heard of autism, and I think many people have met one or two autistic people in their lives, but they might not fully understand that autism can really vary person by person, and also by kind of like level of support needs from someone that has very subtle or kind of like communication quirks to people that have higher needs. And so that just because one person doesn't act the same way as another person doesn't mean that they might both be on the spectrum. A few other kind of things you might think through. There's no one thing a person can do or not do that confirms that they're autistic or rules out autism. And people with autism can show different skills and weaknesses and areas of support kind of across different settings or circumstances. So people act differently in different settings. Doesn't mean that they do or do not have autism. Something that I think can be important to explicitly say, depending on the audience, is that autism does not equate to intelligence. So, of course, it's certainly possible for people with autism to have differences in their learning or their intellectual abilities. But there's people with autism who, have average or above average problem-solving skills and cognitive skills. So that could be a point of clarification if someone is confused, if someone says, oh, but they're so smart, they can't be autistic. That might be a point that you would give a little bit more education there. I think it's a really common and natural thing that when people are learning about autism, they want to know what caused it. And so I think it's maybe helpful to share that we don't typically know what is causing autism, but we do know, I think for you as a caregiver, I want you to feel empowered, especially if you're talking to that family member or someone else in the child's lives, maybe even to tell yourself, autism isn't caused by anything that a parent did or didn't do. And then a couple other concepts, autism is a lifelong disability, right? So we don't expect children to grow out of autism, but autistic kids will grow and develop and learn new skills. And the way that their autism looks can often change as they get older. But they just might need a little bit of extra support to learn new things. And we know that the language that we use can really shape how someone understands a child, also how they understand themselves. And so sometimes we can make really subtle changes in how we talk about features of autism to make the language just more neutral or highlight strengths. Again, it might seem kind of silly to just adjust words that you're saying, but it can kind of really reframe things to be more positive or less stigmatized. So you can try to reframe things from a deficit to try to explain how a person learns best. So rather than rigid, we might say they really thrive within routines and structure. Maybe instead of saying a child has preoccupations or obsessions, you're saying they have special interests or deep interests. And then sometimes it's just helpful to be more specific and clear with our descriptions. So instead of saying a child struggles with social skills, we might say that they can be literal or they tend to be a more direct communicator, something like that. And of course, again, trying to highlight their strengths at the core of all of these conversations. So if someone is getting to know your child, maybe like a coach or a teacher, in addition to sharing the areas where they need a little bit of extra support, I think it's really important to highlight their strengths, the things that they're passionate about, the things that make them a unique individual. So kind of making sure to make a point to highlight strengths within these conversations. You can go ahead to the next slide. So again, if we're kind of thinking about someone like a teacher or a coach or a camp counselor, these people might have kind of varying levels of knowledge about autism, but they're not going to necessarily know your child or their unique strengths and needs. So this is a strategy that we talk a lot about, kind of creating an all about me page to share with someone new in the child's life. So you could create your own. There's also lots of templates out there online that you could use. But again, you kind of fill it out with, in addition to maybe areas where a child needs a little bit extra support, but also their strengths, their interests, the ways that they learn the best, maybe how we can accommodate their sensory needs, situations where they tend to struggle a little bit more. So if there's someone new in your child's life, they're not just kind of making assumptions about the child, but really getting to know them as an individual and setting that foundation to focus on their strengths. And this might even be a good example of something that you could fill out along with the child. So they're kind of like part of the experience of just figuring out how to describe themselves, learning how to explain their strengths and their needs, that sort of thing. All right. And then I just wanted to quickly comment on just like, what about the stranger? What if your child is struggling a little bit, or maybe not even struggling, maybe just kind of like stimming or kind of drawing attention to themselves a little bit when you're out in public, at the store or the playground, like a place of worship, something like that. You can really decide what's best for you and your child and how or if you want to communicate with people around you, but really don't feel like you're obligated to disclose your child's diagnosis to someone that doesn't know them very well or to, apologize for them. People with disabilities are welcome in society. And in order for us to really be an inclusive society, the people around the child need to learn how to be accepting and supportive. So I think if anything, in that moment, you might focus on advocating for what your child needs. Maybe they need a little bit of extra space or a quiet room. Maybe they need instructions broken down into simpler steps, that kind of thing. Okay. And now I'm going to briefly touch on this idea of teaching a child about their own diagnosis. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to hear from Monica as well. But just a few kind of things I would encourage you to consider. A person needs to be able to understand themselves and their own needs in order to be able to self-advocate. So I think many of us have goals for kids as they grow and get older and head into adulthood to be more independent and be able to speak up for what they need. That's a big part of being able to be independent, is to know where your needs are. And so that probably involves them understanding where are the areas that they tend to struggle more. So understanding the autism diagnosis would help them to do that. And then another point is later diagnosed autistic adults experience higher rates of mental health conditions. I think there's many factors that go into that. It's kind of pretty complex, but one underlying factor might be kind of this feeling of not fully understanding themselves, feeling like they have to maybe hide who they are, or kind of recognizing they're different from other people, but not really being able to put their finger on why. And many people who are diagnosed in adulthood or who learn about their autism diagnosis in adulthood really experience a feeling of relief when they hear their diagnosis and really can kind of like look back on their childhood and make sense of some of the challenges they had growing up that maybe they didn't fully understand. So sometimes you wonder if maybe they learned about their autism diagnosis earlier, if maybe they wouldn't have struggled to understand themselves as much. And then I just have one more quick slide here. This is some of the concepts that we already talked about so much in the case, which is amazing. Again, feel like a broken record, but if you're talking to a child about their autism diagnosis, I would lead with talking about their strengths, maybe having everyone in the family discuss their own strengths, their own weaknesses, areas that are easy for them, areas that are harder for him, to kind of set this foundation of this idea of neurodiversity. Everybody's brain works differently. Everyone needs different levels of support for different areas. Some families choose to discuss autism pretty openly and freely from the very beginning, from when their child is very young. They just kind of like talk about autism as a kind of open conversation. And again, this kind of goes back to this idea that if you are avoiding talking about something or saying a word, it might make it more confusing or might be something scary or something that a child is really worried about, versus if you're kind of talking about it kind of casually, it kind of takes some of that power and stigma away from the word. And then someone had already brought up this idea. It's a trick that we use with kids with a lot of different types of disabilities, but to try to learn together about some famous autistic people or celebrities. Again, you can be autistic and not be a savant or not be a celebrity, and that's also great and fine too. But I think having this representation of the spectrum of what autism is, and that autistic people can be capable of all sorts of things, can really kind of like shift a focus a little bit for someone that's just starting off on that journey. Alrighty, I want to hand it over to Monica.
Thanks, Kate. That was great. So first, I just want to start with a couple of resources. So I have two boys with varying support needs. My older son has high support needs. My younger son has very low support needs. When we were telling my younger son about his diagnosis, there was just a lot of anxiety around it. And I think he had thought that he was going to turn into his brother, right? So I think that kind of to Kate's point of it's a spectrum. There's so many different people is so important. You are who you are, and everyone is different, right? And everyone's support needs are different in the world, typical or neurotypical. So for my younger son, we walked through, I don't have a picture on here, but this book that's called Sometimes Noise is Big. And what it was a book where we talked about it, kind of goes through, and at the end of the book, you can kind of make your own assumption, hey, these are things that sometimes, he was saying, oh, I sometimes struggle with that. And we kind of sat at the end of the book and just said, so what does this mean? This just means your brain works differently, and this is autism. And I think having that visual and also his own experience to reflect on made that diagnosis a lot easier. But it did come with that anxiety of oh, am I going to wake up tomorrow and have some communication challenges like my brother, but it really just did start a dialogue. So I think books are great resources. I learn every day from reading different things and from other people's experiences, just as a parent as well, on this topic. And then another book, which I like to read to my kids' classmates, is Why Johnny Doesn't Flap. Neurotypical is okay. And this book is from a autistic person's point of view. So it kind of goes through hey, Johnny doesn't get worried about being late for school in the morning, or he doesn't want to eat the same pizza every day on Friday, and kind of, again, just changes that perspective of what it means to be neurotypical, and hearing it as a strength rather than a weakness, which sometimes I feel it can be portrayed on. So another great resource. Those are my two favorites on this list, but there's a lot of information. And then just before I go on the next slide, just want to say, as a parent, provider, it is your job to support your child. It is not your job to educate other people on autism. You can be kind and provide people resources, but it's not on you to do research for your grandparents, teachers, providers, right? These All About Me's are great. I'm giving you what I know supports my child, but I'm not going to hand you a book that says, please read this Autism Out Loud book because it's going to help you be a better grandparent, right? People need to do their own research and want to learn as well, right? It's not your responsibility to do that on top of everything else. So next slide. Okay, sibling education. I think this, I look back and as before my younger son was diagnosed and he just had this brother, we could have done this a lot better, but I like to say when you know better, you do better. So this is just kind of what I know now, right? And that will continue to change as I grow in this journey as well. But I think starting early and talking openly is so important. You want to encourage questions and really talk freely about it. To Kate's point, destigmatize it, right? Autism, it's a disability. People with disabilities have existed in this world forever. No one is less than. It's just a part of the human experience, right? It's not a bad word. And then I think the other thing is explaining therapy. In those early days, we had a lot of therapists come into our house, or we were dragging my younger son with us to therapy sessions for my older son. And to him, it was like, oh, he's getting all this fun playtime and getting to playing with Play-Doh and cool toys. And I'm sitting in this waiting room hanging out with mom. Like, what is this about? Just being better with like explaining, hey, what does this look like? And if there were opportunities to integrate him within that therapy, kind of looking for those experiences as well. And then just normalize it, right? Acknowledge the challenges. We talk about it all the time, right? Sometimes it's hard. It's a little bit harder for my family to go to a baseball game than it is for other families in our neighborhood. And it's okay to admit that, right? And kind of what I like to pair that with is I say, hey, Bren, I get this is hard and we're going to have to split up and divide and conquer. But guess what? When you go to Disney World, you don't have to wait in line like your friends do too, right? There's positive and negative to every experience. But I think it's important to acknowledge that. Really find your village, look for families with shared experiences. We've been the most successful in our relationships and kind of educating ourselves about autism and my younger son in just like having another family, right, who has similar support needs to my older son. And he also has a younger brother, and they've become really close friends because they have this bond about having siblings that are a little bit different, but then they get together and they can also have these maybe more common sibling experiences when they're together. Next slide, please. And then the other thing is like looking for support groups. I think there's one more before that too, Meg. Looking for sib groups as well to really kind of allow your other children to have a place where they can vent and talk to someone about their experience that they might not be comfortable talking to you about. And the other thing, foster empathy and connection. I think as humans, we all can be good with this, right? You want to lead by example. Look for ways to connect with not only your child, but also there's autistic people in society everywhere, right? I kind of like look out for other people. I try to lead by example for my kids to say, hey, like this person needs help, right? How are we going to help them out? Or what is a way that, just like you would do a food allergy, right? I wouldn't send a snack to school for my kids with peanut butter if there was a peanut butter allergy in the class, right? So if my son is having a birthday party and there's someone with support needs, like, hey, let's talk about it. How do you think we can support so-and-so? How can we make this experience a little bit easier for them? And then look for ways to foster that connections through common interests between the siblings as well. My kids love amusement parks. Both of them do. It's a place where we can act like a quote unquote typical family. Everyone can be successful. They can ride rides together and it's a positive experience. So kind of looking for more ways to integrate that is so important. This is a big one, but providing individual time. It can be a lot running a child to therapy or having to eat a lot of chicken nuggets in your house or whatever that is. So one thing I try to do with my younger son is kind of get some individual time with him. We'll maybe go to a sporting place, or we'll take him to a Phillies game, or do some one-on-one things to make sure that he has time with myself and my husband. And then we kind of always just say, hey, check in a lot. Are you doing okay? How's it going? Like, are you feeling? How are you feeling, etc. But that individual time can be really hard to carve out, but it is so important. And even if it's 5 minutes before bed, that I think makes a big difference. And then encourage questions, even the hard ones, and know that it's okay to not have all the answers. I don't know what life's going to look like in 20 years for my older son. I have a vision that I hope it is, but we don't know what that future is going to be yet, right? That's up for him to decide. And we're going to work together and provide him all the support that we can to be successful. But as my younger son gets older, if he has questions like that, I'm going to be open and honest with him and include him in those discussions as well. All right, next slide. And then takeaways, I think kind of the gist of this entire ECHO has really been that knowledge is power, right? The more families and their loved ones are educated about autism and know how and can talk about concerns and manage concerns through their journey, the less scary and overwhelming it really is. And again, just to reiterate, like, you can provide family resources, but it's not on you to do their own research. I think the example of a child doing that research for their sibling is so great, right? But if they don't, it's not on them to educate their grandparents and stuff like that if that's not something they want to do as well, right? So you got to do what's comfortable and works for your family. And everyone's different, and you can always learn from other people and their experiences along the way. And I think that's it.
Awesome. Meg, we lost the slide deck, so I don't know if there's time for questions. There's also going to be a poll that's going to pop up for the group. So if folks have, there have been some nice things kind of going back and forth in the chat, some